environment.
But we have a few questions already. So I think the first one would be for you, Jonathan. Does the cabling redundancy require a different pathways or just a different routes in the same pathway?
For the rated 3, we don't require different pathways, but we recommend it. And for the rated 4, we also don't require it, but recommend that because you have different distributors for the rated 4, you really should have different pathways for the routes, but again, don't require it because in some topologies for the data center, particularly where you only have IOs in certain places, it may not be possible for them to, for the cables to follow completely different routes. But we recommend that they be different.
Okay. I have one for you, Edward. Does EPI certify data centers that it designed? So basically, does EPI certify a data center that EPI designed?
No, we don't, because that will be a clear conflict of interest under the ISO rules. So we never get involved with any data center that we have been involved in from a consulting/design type of perspective. So that's totally separated.
Another one for you, Jonathan. Is there any recommendation of having patch panel to connect servers to switch within the same cabinet, or can they be connected directly with patch ports?
So actually, in the TI standard, we have some guidelines regarding what we call direct attach cabling. So we permit direct attach cabling between equipment in the equipment distribution area or the server cabinet area, within a cabinet, and to an adjacent cabinet. So you would typically have a top of rack switch at the top of the cabinet or maybe in the adjacent cabinet, and you're allowed to run a cable directly to that. And that might be not only just structured type cable, the patch cords that we use, category 6, 6A type cables, but they also might not be the common cables. They might be something like an AOC cable or a DAC cable, which are outside the scope of our standard. And then within a distributor like the main distributor or the horizontal distributor, which might consist of a large number of cabinets, you're allowed to do direct attach cabling within that distributor, though we prefer it to be within a row of cabinets. So if your main distributor is very large, it consists of many rows, we would recommend that you install patch panels between the rows for that.
I think I have another one for you, Edward. Is there a time limit on the design certification?
Yes, there is. There is an initial time limit of 1 year. However, that is extendable in case that the design is still ongoing or the construction has not finalized yet. Then it can be extended with another year or even another year after that. Once the data center goes in operations, then it is expected that the customer moves forward with the facility certification.
I think we have another one for you, Jonathan. Can you please summarize what will be included in the Edge Data Center addendum? Will it include information on distribution areas, cabling recommendations, rack cabinet recommendations, etc.?
Right, yeah. Those subjects are covered, and I actually brought up a copy of the document that's currently being balloted. So why don't I go over the headings for the Edge Data Center addendum, and that would answer your question. So there's the scope, the modifications to the TI-942 standard, then going into Annex G, which is the normative section regarding the additions to TI-942 regarding Edge Data Center. So there's sections on Edge Data Center design considerations, including things like sealing and anchoring enclosures, site location, anchoring equipment, and then there's a section on risk and hazards, a section on ventilation and cooling, one on energy efficiency for edge data centers, another one on monitoring, one on security, one on cabling pathways, a section on edge data center administration, another one on edge data center electrical, one on lighting, fire protection, water infiltration, and then we have another annex in TI-942 that we'll be adding regarding the rating of edge data centers. And there's a whole set of tables similar to what we did in TIA-942 for standard data centers, but for edge data centers.
Jim, I think we have a question for you. Is there any relation on risk mitigation and being certified?
I think there's a correlation. In my perspective, I would say that once you're certified, you've demonstrated that you've reduced some risk, of course, because you've implemented best practices. Of course, risk mitigation, when we think about it, you're evaluating and prioritizing your risks. So holistically in a data center, when you implement this standard and you're audited on it, you're bringing the risk level down by doing those best practices and being in alignment with the standard. So it is a risk mitigation method, but of course there are frameworks that are overarching that would address other parts of your business that, you know, aren't addressed in TIA-942. But as far as availability and uptime goes, it's always important to remember that, you know, this is a stepping stone and just a nice complement when we talk about mitigating risk in a data center environment.
I think this one's for Edward. Is it a given that TIA certification leads to compliance with other standards organization, or is it a standalone?
Well, you know, there are obviously many standards available. So there are certain aspects. For example, if you look at, say, fire safety, TIA references other fire safety standards like the NFPA 75, etc. But obviously, there are so many other standards like building codes that need to be complied to. So you cannot say, once I've done TIA-942, I can get rid of all the other compliance and other audits because that is not correct. So you still have to go for the individual areas of specialization like the building codes, electrical standards, etc., in order to see compliance for that particular aspect.
Maybe that's something you can answer, Edward. Can we use TIA-942 to certify edge data center?
Well, yes and no. We have the TIA-942 ready, so that is aimed at modular style type of data center. It's not really aimed at edge in itself, and that's why TIA had the initiative to develop the edge addendum, which will be released to the TIA-942. So that one, once released, will be the most appropriate one to apply to that environment. In the meantime, people could, of course, opt for the 942 ready as such.
Yeah, if it's not installed yet, I think the 942 ready is probably good. If it's installed, we can always use the current TIA-942, but it's going to be easier once we have the addendum ready.
Correct.
Good. Is there a plan to make TIA-942 an ISO standard? I don't know if, Jonathan, you want to take a shot at this one.
Yeah, actually, I also serve on the U.S. tag that for the ISO IEC standards, and the ISO IEC standards are a different set of standards than the TIA standards. So almost everybody from the U.S. that attends the ISO IEC JTC1, SC25, Working Group 3, which are the telecommunications cabling standards meetings that develop the data center cabling standards and a lot of other cabling standards were from TIA, but we provide input to the international standards, but TIA-942 is a separate standard from the ISO IEC standards. And to be honest, it's one country, one vote. So the US, Mexico, and Canada, which is all of North America, has the same number of votes as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And then, of course, Europe has, you know, many more countries than we do. So the standards tend to look more like the European standards, the ISO standards, because there are more country votes from Europe than there are from Asia and the Americas combined. So we provide input. So it's essentially we provide input, but they're really separate standards.
I think this could be one for you, Edward. Is there a path for an already rated 3 data center to become a rated 4?
Yeah, in principle there is. Obviously there are some potential changes that the data center operator owner need to consider. most of the time what we find that in a rated 3 data center, most of them are already compliant to, for example, having multiple active paths, which is a requirement for the rated 4. But in rated 4, there is a more tricky statement, so to speak, that says that the data center kind of like need to be autonomous, i.e. you must be able to automatically detect a fault, isolate it automatically, and continue operation automatically. That's the whole idea behind being fault tolerant. And that requires, quite a bit of changes compared to a rated 3 data center. So electrical typically there, telecommunication typically there. On the chiller installation, that is typically where most data centers are, having to do quite a bit of work to become rated 4, as well as making sure that in rated 4 there is an additional requirement for fully separation physically, compartmentalization between the A and the B, where in rated 3 some areas like electrical are still allowed to be combined because it's only required to be maintainable. So it is possible, but it varies beside how easy or how difficult it might be.
And maybe Jonathan, is there any have you seen that before in your practice?
I think as Edward mentioned, it's possible, but you'd have to add redundant distributors, for example, on the telecommunications side. So you'd have to add things to the infrastructure to make that work out. And considering if the data center is already running, that might be really, really messy. It might be easier, really, just starting from scratch rather than trying to retrofit a rated 3 data center.
Yeah, I could only imagine if someone asked, from an operator's perspective, if someone asked us to go from a rating 3 to a rating 4, the undertaking and adding the infrastructure may outweigh the cost of just saying, let's start over and build one purpose-built to be fault tolerant. I think that question might come up because the risk for interruption and all the construction to just get the infrastructure in place might be too arduous.
That's a very good point. Which organizations are authorized to certify the TIA-942 standard? Currently, we're in the process of defining all of those criteria. We're revamping the overall process. We have partners that are currently doing TIA certification. They're advertised on our websites. So if you look at the TIAonline.org, you can find in this auditing section, you're going to find who the current partners are.
That's TIA-942 org, no spaces, breaks, or dashes. Is that right?
Yeah, you can use the TIA-942.org, or you can go straight to TIAonline.org as well. They both have the same information. How to make the data center compatible with 5G, and what type of basic change are required? Is it something you've encountered so far?
Well, I think when you talk about data centers and 5G, the first thing you have to think of is obviously edge, which Jonathan's talked a little bit about already in its relation to TIA-942. But 5G is inherently affecting the structure of how data centers operate because just the nature of 5G at its core, the whole idea, the whole concept is low latency application and network architecture that bring faster, more robust, bringing the core closer to the end, et cetera, right? So when we think about that in a big colocation data center like the ones that I operate and we host for our customers, that's really, in my opinion, not what's really bringing 5G to the table. The edge is going to really dictate a lot of how 5G impacts our day-to-day. So when we think about 5G, I would say think of the edge, think of where the edge needs to be, whether it's in city centers where large data centers aren't available, because typically you're not sticking a large, 40, 50 megawatt colocation data center in the middle of a giant city. It's going to be on the outskirts. So are your edge data centers for the 5G deployments going to be in the middle of a large city? Are they going to be in rural areas? Where are these things going to be? What's the application? But I think it all depends on the edge and where the edge is going and how fast, reliable, and secure the edge is going to be. Because reliability may not be as important with the edge, depending, but security and largely just the the integrity of the whole deployment is going to be very important.
What are the advantages of TIA-942 standard to an operator that serves only its critical load? I think this one, Jim, can you answer this one?
Yeah, so that's, if I'm reading the question right, this is talking about colocation. So we, as you know, for my instance at Iron Mountain Data Centers, our customers make up our IT load, right? So our critical load for the whole building is the total facility, and we realistically don't control what our customers do. They move in, they're a partner and a tenant, and if they want 5 megawatts of the data center, they take 5 megawatts and they do their thing. So the advantage of how the TIA-942 implementation process is for a co-location, it's still looking at all the same aspects, right? You're still looking at fire safety, site selection, architecture. You're looking at how the MDAs, IDAs, and all the topology is laid out. You're still looking at the cross connects and cable runs. So there's still a lot of advantage, right? Even if you're not controlling the IT load in your facility, and you're not going down to the rack level, everything up until you get to that customer's suite or to their cage is considered. And I think that's what really sets TIA-942 apart, is because it does look at that larger approach for the data center site. But then beyond that, if you're a customer within a co-location data center, you can also have that assessment done for the space that you reside in. And this is actually an assessment I'm going through right now with a few of our customers. The site's not being evaluated as a whole, but their space, whether it's 4, 5, or 6 megawatt, is being assessed. So there's advantages on both sides of it. If you're a co-location operator, and I say this totally independent and objective from my position, but if you're a co-location operator that has customers that want the standard, that want the assessment, it's not out of the question. And then, of course, if you're operating a big data center, it's also an option. You can get that entire facility looked at as well.
How much emphasis is given to the 5 stages of the commissioning process to the ICT structured cabling system? Anybody wants to take this one?
Yeah, in general, if you look at the commissioning process, because it applies to the facility normally, of course, there are individual commissioning processes, for example, for the network infrastructure, which is typically done by the installers, where they do the traditional testing of the fiber and the other connectivity over copper. And those reports are normally evaluated during an audit, where obviously the audit itself is non-intrusive. So when we go in, we're not pulling cables, we're not pressing buttons, etc. So we would look at, for example, has the data center equipment been properly tested and commissioned? The testing reports and commissioning reports will be reviewed to make sure that everything is done appropriately, and that includes, for example, also the network infrastructure. The IT itself is out of scope for TIA, so we were not looking at, servers and storage and all those parts that is out of the scope.
What's the recommendation about interconnection between equipment through fiber or UTP patch boards? Jonathan, I think, can you answer this one?
Sure. That's actually that direct attach cabling issue that we discussed. So you can directly attach equipment in data centers. If they're in the server area or the equipment distribution area, you're allowed to do that. Directly attach equipment with UTP, fiber, DAC cables, AOC cables, or other peripheral type cabling like SCSI cables, if they're in adjacent cabinets. And if you want to go further than that, I suppose you could, but we recommend that you limit that to the same cabinet or an adjacent cabinet. And then, as I mentioned before, in your distributors, like your main distribution area or horizontal distribution area, you're allowed to patch between equipment within the distributor, but we recommend that you go through a patch panel if you have to cross them.
This is all the time we have today. The additional questions, we'll answer them by email. We'll make sure we get all the questions answered. So this is all the time we had. I would like to extend a big thank you to all our guest speakers for their time and sharing their expertise today.